Om Brahmanandam Paramasukadam Kevalam Gyanamurtim Dandvaititam Gagana Sadrisham Tatvama Shadilaksham Ekam Nityam Vimlamachalam Sarvadi Sakshi Bhutam Bhavatitam Trigunarahitam Sadgurum Tan Namami. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. We salute the leader of our souls, through whose grace our ignorance is dispelled, who is beyond good and bad, pleasure and pain, life and death, and all other pairs of opposites. We recognize that one as the only witness to the changing phenomena of this universe. May we through that grace go beyond darkness and delusion and realize the truth in this very life. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Hiranmaye Parikoshe Virajan Brahmanishkalam Tachubram Jyotisham Jyoti Tadyadatma Vidho Viduhu. Shining like burnished gold, highest and deepest, the core intelligence of living beings, partless and indivisible, free of any and all taint, the essence of everything which all beings seek, knowingly or unknowingly. There shines Brahman. It is that which the Guru teaches. It is that which the wise ones exult in. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahanau Bhunaktu, Saha Viryam Karavavahai, Tejasvi Navaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May Brahman sustain us. May Brahman illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om. Good morning on Saturday morning in the summer in Portland, Oregon, where we come to you all and to the live streaming audience for a live streaming class. We haven't seen you for several weeks on live streaming because we've been on retreat in San Francisco, Sacramento area on the American River, where we had salient teachings about Vedanta and yoga, other systems of India that we study in SRV in order to shore ourselves up against the vagaries and vicissitudes of Maya, against all the insinuations of the 6 passions and 8 fetters, 5 kleshas, and also to gain knowledge of the 24 cosmic principles. All of these things may seem like a lot at first, but if the mind gears itself towards understanding them and recounting them, memorizing them, and diving deep into knowledge of them, then this life moves on smoothly, karmas are neutralized, and one leaves one's body in a conscious way and comes back again in another lifetime, if one should take another lifetime, in memory of all these great teachings. And that's what we see in the case of sages and seers and saints, that they remember a lot of what they have learned in a previous lifetime, previous existence, and therefore they're very well equipped for life, although in most cases they're not seeking the same things that earthly or worldly people are seeking. They've acquired all those things, as Krishna says in the Gita about himself, and now they just come to help others to acquire those and fulfill their desires. One of the teachings we had at the river retreat was the 9 ways of fulfilling desire. 3 of them, if you remember, which were not possible because one hadn't taken refuge in the Dharma. And the other 6 were various ways like sublimation and transparency and asceticism and ways in which people deal with their desires in order to fulfill them so that they can get on to the deeper meaning of life, that is, the gaining of enlightened states of mind, clear mind or pure mind, which makes, of course, life into a divine life or a dharmic life. So in Portland, as we return here in the summer, the Portland Sangha has been studying the Svetashvatara Upanishad, as has the San Francisco Sangha. And in the case of Portland, we have made it all the way to the final chapter, chapter 6. Those of you following the text all this while, we've had 5 chapters of many, many, many slokas of great merit, full of poeticism and deep wisdom, very convincing, as the Upanishads say. And in chapter 6 we embark upon the final curtain, if you will, of this great Upanishad that the great Rishi Svetashvatara has in store for us. And we finished up last time with quite a bit in chapter 5 about the difference between the personal Brahman and the impersonal God, the Lord of the universe, Mother of the universe, being in her personal aspect, saguna, with gunas, and then the difference between that and the formless reality called nirguna, free of attributes, free of qualities. The Upanishads always very specific and very perceptive about making a subtle line of distinction between the two, not so much in terms of separations, as we say, but more in terms of just practical thinking, because human beings find themselves in the body with a set of 5 senses and amidst the 5 elements and the objects made of 5 elements, and then a mind-ego complex, which includes plenty of intelligence, we hope. And with that Purastika body, or eightfold body, they sometimes call it in earliest days, out of that came that conception of the 24 cosmic principles. The body-mind mechanism, Vedanta sometimes calls it, or the psychophysical being. With all of that in front of us, then we have to approach gingerly and with sensitivity and with some rather special techniques the formless Brahman, sometimes called Almighty Father or Buddha nature or Allah in other traditions. So it's not something you can easily jump to and adhere to when you're sporting a body-mind mechanism, because many of these things have to drop away, at least in concept and in mind, in order to enter into such a profound state called nirvana or nirvikalpa samadhi. So that's one reason why they draw this distinction between God with form and the formless reality, so that we can, number one, if you will, in a tantric way, deify everything here rather than become attached to it or averse to it. Because attachment and aversion, we know, are two of the great impediments in yoga. Yoga meaning union of this apparently individualized self with the Supreme Self. And number two, know that there is a higher supreme goal, gatam gatam paragatam, as Buddha would say, to go beyond all goals to the highest goal. So one of those goals would be the satisfaction or fulfillment of legitimate desires, say. Maybe the next echelon of goal would be attainment of peace of mind. And beyond that, then forbearance and equanimity of mind, and those kinds of things. One steps towards these lesser goals, which are very important as requisites to a higher goal or supreme goal. So don't worry about it yet if your highest goal isn't the formless Brahman. Everything comes in its right time, and so do the experiences of the formless Brahman, called nirvikalpa or nirvana. Father of Yoga called it asampragyata, seedless samadhi. They always point to those with a combination of great reverence and, as I say, great sensitivity and care, because easy to fall off a cliff. And the ascent to the formless Brahman is rather like a cliff without many footholds. One has to acclimatize oneself to it gradually and arrive at the supreme goal as the ultimate aim of life. Very, very rare. Reading the Bhagavad Gita and studying it at the river retreat, we found out how 1 in 1,000 even desires to find God, and then just 1 in those 1,000 of those who desire to see God actually approach, and then 1 in 1,000 of those actually begins to practice, and 1 in 1,000 of those maybe gains the goal. So requisite goals are fine. Don't worry about that. Just attain things that quicken your dispassion, as Holy Mother Sri Sharda Devi says. Things that bind you in, have the strength and willpower to give them up, to renounce them. And then those things that quicken your dispassion and hone your intelligence, those things you can attain. And that's called sampadana, or getting some attainment under your belt. And those will keep you in good stead as you storm that final gate of formless reality. So in chapter 5 we saw that was the case. They made subtle distinction between the Lord with all qualities who rules over all beings, and we showed a few charts that about the many-faced, many-armed deity. And so that's rather a tantric view. Let us know that so that we learn how to convert all this into God with form. Then when we have it all deified nicely, then we're able and we have the capacity to begin to see through forms to that underlying substratum called Brahman or Chaitanya or pure conscious awareness, timeless, deathless consciousness, those kinds of terms, all pervasive. And then we can begin to get glimpses of that beyond the veils of form. So chapter 5 was a quick summation of that. Chapter 6 goes on in somewhat the same vein, but it begins to speak about the dynamics of the form Brahman, with God with form. In the first sloka he says, "Some deluded thinkers speak of nature, others of time, as the force that revolves this wheel of Brahman. But really all this is only the glory of God manifested in the world." Mahima is the word in Sanskrit. The glory of God is Mahima, and you have these various powers that we've studied before. Some of them, the 8 occult powers, for instance, you'll see them falling in this chart that we're about to present as some of the 50 spokes of the great wheel. That is Viparyayas and so forth. They're pretty much impediments to your goal. But as far as other powers like Mahima, that's the power of God. It says here in this sloka, the glory of God that manifests in the world. So many beings who love divine reality, who still maybe haven't gained full enlightenment and knowledge of what it is, see the glory of God through nature and get inspired. And that's, again, a step towards higher realization. You won't want to get caught in form or stick just with nature, because nature is, in my tradition, called insentient. There's intelligence behind it, but that intelligence comes from mind and intellect and from, of course, higher principle of Brahman. All intelligence, like from the Word, spilling out from the Word, is these rays of intelligence. So we will want to stay rather close to the sentient principle and just see the glory of God reflecting through nature. That would be a matter of inspiration for us, and it would help our meditations. There are many scriptures like that who say, like in the Gita again, find a nice place, not too high, too low, put your sacred seat, your asana down on it and sit. Place that is free of undue sounds or interruptions and distractions. And you have some water flowing by or some bird sound or things that kind of in nature that lend to that manifestation of God's glory. It doesn't have to be glory in a effusive way. It can be glory in a subtle way too. There are many subtleties of nature which point towards divine state. So that word Mahima, we should point out that contrary to and much higher than the 8 occult powers are the 6 powers of the Lord, Mahima and so forth, Bala, those kinds of words indicate that higher power of the Lord. So the Upanishad opines here that some people speak of nature as being that force, and some speak of time, but they want to say all those things, nature, time, space, cause and effect, manifestation, all that, that's really the glory of Brahman manifesting in the universe. So it can put a sort of pointer on that for us and clarify it. And mentioning the wheel of Brahma, we hearken back to this chart then, the Brahma Chakra, which I put together back in chapter 1, as you remember. And not only is it a very intense description, but it's also a very in-depth look at God with form. And in the tradition of Vedanta, the Vedicists and so forth aren't at all shy around calling a spade a spade. They're not going to fill the world just with good things and say that's God. The wheel of Brahman has many things on here which are very painful and very questionable, and which acts really, they're not meant to act as deterrents really, they're meant to act as stumbling blocks in your way, in your path, so that you can surmount them and gain strength. This strength will be internal, of course. A hiker has to gain strong muscles and so forth, and good breath control and all of that. The same with the spiritual sojourner inside, has to learn how to surmount obstacles and go straight towards the goal without stopping and prematurely. So if you look at this and the live streaming audience looks at this, you can see here that we hearken back to that first chapter when we think of Brahman as a grand wheel propelled by means of a single belt whose every revolution gives rise to 2, with triple tires, driven along 3 different roads, that has 16 extremities, 50 spokes, 20 counter spokes, and 6 sets of 8s. If you want to put it all in a summation. Now, if you want to give the symbology to that, Brahman is a grand wheel with a single belt, propelled by means of a single belt. There's the belt across the top, as it were, always revolving, and as it revolves, it always gives rises to 2 with every revolution. So this means the dualities are always coming up with every revolution. Dualities can delude the human soul, and it's like things like virtue and vice, and pleasure and pain, and attachment and aversion act as great deterrents to the soul along the path. That's why you want to gain that equanimity and transcendence of the pairs of opposites. So if you can see with the belt, on one side, for instance, is virtue, on the other side is vice. or on one side is happiness and the other side is misery. So this revolving belt, if you know it well, then you will be able to transcend the pairs of opposites and move off of that constant cycles that are going on. This is a cosmic wheel, remember, so beings are all caught in it. As, for instance, the quote says, "So long as the embodied soul imagines separation from Brahman, so long does it continue to spin on the cosmic wheel, enjoying and suffering experiences there. It gains freedom when it realizes its oneness with Brahman." So that's rather put-offish. You see this wheel of dualities all the time. It's really kind of a testing ground to see if beings are ready to transcend dualities or if they're still attached. Because God realization is not for the weak or for the compromising. You have to make a definite commitment to it and seek it and pour all your energy and attention into it. So that wheel acts as a nice testing ground to see which ones are ready and strong enough to get off cycles of happiness and sorrow and pleasure and pain, and which ones aren't yet strong enough. Also, it mentions one Feli, see in the middle there, that huge crown of the cosmic being there, which is really nature or Maya. That, of course, a subject of its own needs to be transcended. Maya, really, the definition we get from Swami Vivekananda is the worlds of name and form in time and space based on causation. So you have Desha, Kala, Nimitta, Nama, Rupa. There's that sort of quintuplication there that is a very strong distraction, considerable distraction to try and overcome, fivefold distraction. So with all of that as the beginnings of this great wheel of Brahman, according to the rishis of India, we can see what a marvelous cosmic machine it is. And of course, right away, it has triple tires that it moves along. And those, any student of Vedanta or Vedic philosophy would immediately be suspicious. So triple, if you mentioned three tripudis like that, and you probably would start thinking of things like the gunas. And at the American River Retreat recently, we did a full study, almost 4, 5, 6 day study on the three gunas, and had many different looks at them so that we could be well in knowledge of how they work in our mind, how they work in nature, and how they work in activity. Those three things, another 3 and 3 kind of puzzle that we have to unwrap. So there you see it on the diagram, Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. Sattva at the heart. So those three are a triple strand, says Ram Prasad in one of his poems. I was listening to it last night at 3 in the morning. A triple strand which draws the soul on it like an instrument. Sometimes in balance, that is, how did he put it in his poem? Self-interested balance. And then Rajas was restlessness, and Tamas was inertia or slothfulness. So those three tires, this cosmic wheel is always spinning on these three tires. And the soul needs to be tuned by a higher force, get off that triple tire and be tuned by the troubadour, he says, by the divine troubadour, to make himself fit to transcend the three gunas. Now it also is driven along 3 different roads, and that's a good teaching. You see there toward the bottom of the chart. 3 roads are Dharma, Adharma, and Jnanam. So in this way we would say Dharma, of course, is vows and precepts and learning the teachings of the great seers, hearing about them, particularly at first, Shruti. And Adharma is, of course, the opposite of that, not hearing or failing to hear or turning away from teachings that will prepare you for strong spiritual life and realization. And in this case, Jnanam would be the attainment of what you're looking for in Dharma. Gyanam could be Dharma, they could be almost equated, but Dharma is vows and precepts, but as we said earlier, you have to take vows and precepts and actually practice them. You can't just vow to do something and then just hold the vow, but you have to use the vow and the precept to go deeper into the study of a thing and turn it into realization. So that would be Gyanam, or sometimes they call it Vijnanam. So that's really kind of the center of the wheel. That's its main axis. Think of Brahman as a grand wheel with a belt that gives rises to two, one felly, triple tire, and driven along 3 different roads. Now, all of these other concomitants you see here are sort of the effects of driving this car, this cosmic wheel, or being on this cosmic wheel. There you see the 16 extremities on the left, Vikritis of Samkhya Yoga. If you looked at the Samkhya Yoga system of 24 cosmic principles, these would be called the Vikritis. So you have mind, manas, you have your 5 knowledge senses, right? The next sloka is actually going to have us look at that. You have the 5 active senses called karmandriyas and the 5 mahabhutas. So those 16 are called byproducts of intelligence and ego and mind. Those come after the fact, later on in the game, in the evolutionary process. That is spiritual evolution, of course. When we say evolution in Vedanta, we don't mean just Big Bang and turning into planets and space and billions of years go by and evolution takes place in the physical only. We mean the causes of these effects, the cause of the physical effects and the cause of that cause and the deeper and deeper causes that go inside, all the way up to the Word, which Christ said was the ultimate cause in the beginning. So if you want to know these in English, there they are for you to look at. Mind, then hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, and smelling are your Gyanendriyas, and speaking, feeling, moving, procreating, and excretion are the Karmendriyas. I think everyone knows the Mahabhutas, which of course would be ether, air, fire, water, and earth. That's in the level of their subtlety to gross. Ether is the subtlemost, and air is subtle, and then fire is beginning to get gross, and then middling, and then finally you get to water, and earth is the grossest of all elements. That is the densest. So those 21 are called the 16 extremities of this wheel. In other words, the cosmic wheel, when it rolls, is constantly producing minds in Maya, and the mind will then produce bodies equipped with senses, and then the senses will then espy the elements and turn them, senses will turn them into worlds, which the soul can then sport in. So it's a very beautiful look at the so-called evolution of consciousness, if you could call it, or transformation of consciousness, if you could call it such. We would call it in Vedanta, of course, apparent transformation. Now, on the other side of it is the 50 spokes, things like the 5 Viparyayas. Viparyayas, of course, there are 9 of them in yoga. Here is mentioned 5, so you're going to have those basic fallacies that are found in nature. And then there are 28 Ashaktis, that is, deterring powers. There are 9 Tushtis, which are complacencies, or contentments rather. And then the 8 cities, which are the occult powers we mentioned earlier. You can see how they're placed in a category with difficulties, whereas Mahima is the power of the Lord, is a whole different kind or level of power than these 8 occult powers that are sought by beings who have stunted intellects, as they say in the scriptures. 16 extremities, 50 spokes, and 20 counter spokes. The Upanishad says they're wedges or support pegs or linchpins is an interesting word. That is, of course, the 10 senses and their 10 sense objects. We already have the 10 senses, but how the sense objects fasten to the objects of the senses, that's a whole nother counterspoke that goes on. If the senses were just left pure, for instance, then they would just see divine reality reflected in everything. But since they acquire impurities, then they begin to turn objects into something other than what they truly are. They're beginning to fall into the powers and overlays of Maya and projection, mental projection. Then you see the 6 sets of 8 various ashtagas on the right-hand side. Prakrityashtaka, Tattvastaka, Aishvarastaka, Bhavastaka, Devastaka, Gunastaka. That is 8-fold nature, 8 body ingredients, 8 psychic powers, 8 mental states, 8 superhuman beings, and 8 virtues of the soul. It's quite an extensive list, so I put some of them here if you'll just listen. Ether, air, fire, water, earth, mind, intellect, and ego are the Prakriti Ashtaka. And then the Tattvastaka are external skin, internal skin, charma and tvak, blood, flesh, fat, bone, marrow, semen. Then the Aishvarastaka, or the psychic powers, are invisibility, called anima, weightlessness, lagima, expansiveness, vyapti, satisfaction, prakamya, glorification, mahima, domination, ishitva, attraction, vashitva, enjoyment, kama vashayita. So you see that mahima is listed in one of those in a lesser sense. That is the glorification of the ego, you might say. Whether it's the mahima they talk about, the grandness of the cosmic wheel is the power of the Lord. One is a dwarf of the other, you might say. Then bhavastaka are things like righteousness and unrighteousness, knowledge and ignorance, renunciation and attachment, divine powers, and lack of power. So that's an interesting list to contemplate. Then you have the Devastaka, which is these special 8 divine beings: Lord Brahma, Prajapati, the Devas and Devis, the Gandharvas, the Yakshas, the Rakshasas, the Pitris, and the Pishachas. The Pitris are like ancestors, for instance. Gandharvas are celestial musicians in heavenly beings. And then there are some asuric beings there, or negative beings too. So there's these inside of the next atmosphere, inside of the kingdoms of heaven within. There are all these divine beings and at their different levels. So that's an interesting list to contemplate. God with form, as any culture has had these very basic superhuman beings or celestial beings as a part of their cosmological makeup. They have to be provided for as a filler, an instep, or a series of gradations between the human being and the Supreme Being, or the Trinity. For instance, that's why we sing about them in some of our stotrams. Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha, Gurur Eva Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara. We sing about those divine beings, the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, who preside over those 3 levels of cosmic wheel or cosmic process, called creating it and preserving it and destroying it. Conventionally, it might be better said projecting it, sustaining it, and withdrawing it, so that we don't get into the misapprehension that there's any real birth or death going on. It's just a series of manifestations coming forth and rising, and then playing for a while, and then falling back into reality. There's no gain or loss in that. The soul can't be added unto, nor can it be taken away from. And that's certainly true of Brahman too. You can't add anything to it or take anything away from it. It's whole and complete in its entirety from the very inceptionless inception. So that's often expressed musically like that, and the Trinity being at the very head of those sets of superhuman beings. The final set of 8 there, Gunashtaka, then you would have to look at things like compassion, forbearance, non-jealousy, purity, non-fatigue, freedom from poverty, and desirelessness. Those are virtues of the soul, according to the ancient rishis. So you see that the ancient Vedas had their own lists of these divine qualities that were put forth. And which were indigenous to the soul. These are qualities that are there. Sometimes they get covered over by divine beings in their preoccupation with everyday life, conventional things. But then they can be found if one does sadhana and digs deep enough. So a quick look through the Brahmachakra, as we saw it some year and a half ago when we first started into the Svetāśvatara Upanishad. Some of you were here for that, some of you were not present, so a good way to review. Also, we should look at the other way that is allowed us here, this mighty river of Brahman that you see on the other chart on my right, on your left. The quote there from the Upanishad back in early chapters is, "That one who projected consciousness, who is the bridge of immortality, ever tranquil over the wavy and unnavigable ocean of samsara, who delivered the Vedas as a life raft, who is the purifying fire of the mantra stationed firmly in Mayic waters. I go for refuge in that effulgent one whose clear light turns one's understanding towards the Atman." Beautiful, beautiful and very strong, direct statement of not only the presence of divinity called the Atman in Vedanta, but also this way in which it acts as a bridge over troubled waters. So we want to use that phrase in the second millennia here. Like the Vedas, using them as a life raft. And also is the purifying fire of the mantra, like the words spoken by the Guru or contained in the scripture. Very purifying words that keep the soul inspired and free from laziness and things like the 3 gunas and so forth. So when you look at it that way, you see how important words are and how important the scriptures still are. For instance, next week we'll be giving here in Portland the mantra seminar for a couple days, and we'll look into the powerful use of the mantra which we've been given by our gurus and how to unwrap it. I have 2 new charts I prepared. One's called The Meaning of the Gayatri that we'll look into, and the other is called The Meaning of the Mala. Now each seed is what each seed of your mala represents. So that would be added to our usual mantra charts, some 6 or 7 of them that we've taken before, but which we haven't seen for a couple of years. So a good set of 8 or 10 charts in this seminar will remind us of the deep, penetrating, purifying power of the mantra. And mantra can be that mantra you select for your personal ideal, of which there are innumerable mantras for innumerable deities, no doubt. But it can also be just the very way in which words, slokas, suras, sutras, whatever tradition you are from, contain, and how they enlighten the intellect and purify the mind. A great purificatory power. So that's mentioned in this sloka here. The purifying fire of the mantra is that very Brahman. Now in this particular manifestation you see the mighty river of the manifest Brahman. We meditate on it, that Brahman who is like a mighty river, whose source is the boundless ocean. When they say the boundless ocean, that means the mind, cosmic mind, like was shown in this chart here. Only, of course, the cosmic mind called Mahat in Sankhya, the great mind. It contains four things, basically. The mind itself as a projecting power, the intelligence, the thoughts on all levels, from the very most profound thoughts of the deepest thinkers, the intelligence of the most intelligent, as we say in our mantras, and on down all the way to the base thoughts of beings on earth who have no spiritual education or inspiration yet. So all thoughts are contained in that mind. So they pool those all together as if calling the mind this boundless ocean with many waves, many vrittis, as Father of Yoga would call it. It's fed by 5 surging streams. The 5 senses are those. That is, we saw them hearing, seeing, touching, tasting, and smelling. So that ocean of the mind is fed by these 5 streams of the 5 senses. It's always taking things into the mind. And you could say it might be put a little bit cart before the horse if you're looking outside in. But basically, whatever the senses encounter in the world, and they fasten on the objects, that they transfer as impression to the mind. And then the mind reacts. It reacts to pleasure, it reacts to pain, it reacts to boredom, it reacts to stimulation, and it's affected by them. But if you were looking at it properly in the right order, then the intellect and the mind should be using the senses to feel the objects and see what they consist of, and what the dangers are, and what the benefits are of coming in contact with them, and renouncing or engaging as a matter of course, as a final conclusion. So usually people start object senses first and then go inward. The mind is put in that kind of condition. But if you start with intellect and mind first and feel outwardly, sort of like an octopus with its 8 limbs, feeling the dark bottom of the ocean to see what's there, then you gather intelligence, and the mind is in charge of the whole thing instead of we'll see that in the next sloka that we study about the chariot of the mind is always a great teaching from the Gita. That's mentioned in sloka 2, which we're getting to. We're still on sloka 1 here of chapter 6, because they mentioned the wheel of Brahman, so we're looking at 2 different ways in which the ancient rishis, this is thousands of years BC, which is very impressive, isn't it? How they took apart the world with 24 cosmic principles and so forth, and showed it up, you see, for everyone to consider. You can see that some of these things are a pause for consideration in a very sobering way too, as we get into it. The next set. So to conclude, so far we meditate on the Brahman, which is like a mighty river whose source is the boundless ocean, cosmic mind, which is fed by 5 surging streams, the 5 senses, which contains 5 dangerous whirlpools filled with innumerable confusions. That's the 5 subtle senses and their objects: sound, touch, color, flavor, and aroma, or smell. Those things confound the mind, attract it, sort of like a deer is attracted by the hunter's music and falls into a trap. So the wandering Avatut saw that happen once, and was very careful about things like sound, music in that case, things that allure the soul and make it ready for bondage, trap it into bondage, trick it into bondage. So those things have to be watched: sound, color, taste, odor, flavor. They can be great traps and hooks into nature, and the soul finds itself bound. That's why they're called 5 subtle senses, or by way of symbology, whirlpools filled with innumerable confusions. If you see people who are bound to their senses, then it's easy to understand that teaching. It also sports 5 unpredictable currents, that is, ether, air, fire, water, and earth. The beauties of nature have been extolled by poets and by people, enjoyed by people, but the dangers are seldom looked into until it's too late. feast, famine, tidal wave, earthquake, volcano, whatever it is, nature all of a sudden backfires on us and turns around and shows all her terrible power. And those are phenomena in which sometimes many hundreds and thousands of beings are destroyed. Their bodies are destroyed. So that's why they're called unpredictable currents, because everything can be going along fine in nature, and then all of a sudden she'll rear up. Which is also agitated by 5 great tides. That's the 5 pranas. Prana, Udana, Samana, Vyana, and Apana. And if you study the 5 pranas, life force, you'll see there are things like the breath, in-moving, up-moving, held and expelled breath, and that's one form of prana. And the prana that causes your blood to circulate, distributing nutrients to the different organs, and the upward moving prana that causes thoughts to get inspired, the downward moving prana. These 5 pranas are a great study, not just on the level of hatha or breathing exercises, pranayama, but as a means to master them so that one can use them for spiritual realization. Prana is one of the first things you want to, mastery of prana, that is, one of the first things the yogis want you to attain if you enter into the darshana, or practice of yoga. You have to find out about the pranas, the psychic prana, and other forces as they lead inward towards Shakti, so that you can begin to master them. And if you can do that, then you can keep the senses mastered, and the mind also will, and its thoughts will also be controlled. Prana is a very important element in all this. And so far we're just kind of using the prana in the West for health, physical health. Maybe a little exercise and all of that, and maybe do a couple breathing exercises, but there's much more to it than that. And so they can also be 5 unpredictable 5 great tides that come and go if we're not careful. In other words, the prana waxes and then it wanes. And that's why it's not a good idea to take prana for God, for Brahman. People take nature for Brahman first, that was a mistake. And then they start taking energy for Brahman, that's a mistake. See? Anything that changes is not Brahman. Well, the world is always changing. Prana is also always moving, stopping, flowing again. So you put it in the category of the changeable. You don't have to hate it or become averse to it. You can utilize it, but you definitely don't take it for the non-dual Brahman. That's in its category by itself. You reserve that sacrosanct for something that you're trying to attain, and the pranas can help you attain that if you master them. Finally, it's attended by 5 swirling rapids. That's called the 5-fold miseries. Birth, disease, old age, decay, and death. Those are called the 6 billows in Buddhism. Sometimes they're called the 6 transformations in Vedanta. Here's Sri Ramakrishna's story that kind of goes with this mighty river. He says, the ignorant soul being born into the world is like an unfortunate man accidentally falling into the whirlpool of Vishalakshi, from which he will never return. There's a whirlpool in a river that nearby where he lived, and sometimes people would get caught in that. Then he says, there is the Ganges, for instance. If a man touches its waters anywhere, he can declare, I have touched the Ganges. It is not necessary for him to touch the entire river from Hardwar all the way down to Gangasagar. No matter where you touch the river, you can say, I've touched the river. You don't have to touch it all, the whole course of its length. So in this way, any of these things you see, you could say, I have seen Brahman, if you have the right way of looking. All these things are manifestations of Brahman. But you can see, and as I said at the beginning of the class, that the Vedasists are not at all shy of stating it as it is. These things can be either positive attributes for you to master and grow with, or they could be very detrimental and cause your ruination. So this way, in the first sloka, you can see how the grand Vedic wheel and the mighty river of Brahman are two ways in which the ancient Vedasists have explained God with form, and with all its glory, no doubt, also with all its questionable manifestations too, good, bad, mixed, and the karmas that come from associating with it, if one isn't careful. Now let's go on to sloka 2 before the break. It should be known that energy assumes various forms, such as earth, water, light, air, and ether, at the command of that one who is the master of the gunas, the maker of time, who is omniscient, who is pure consciousness itself, and by whom all this is ever enveloped. Another very powerful mantra there, or sloka. The Sanskrit there, vivartate, is a very important word. That is, Brahman appears as the world, but it doesn't undergo any change itself. That's like coming from that word vivarta, false superimposition. That's very important. So, Brahman appears as the world, but without undergoing any change itself. It always stays continuous and eternal and homogeneous, indivisible, but all of it's like fire emanates heat. Brahman, by its natural higher intelligence, emanates the potential for form to come out of it, and without ever changing its nature at the same time. So that's the way they draw a conclusion about the changeless Brahman. It can give rise to forms, because the word brih means to expand, the Sanskrit root of Brahman. So it can expand. It remains stationary, but becomes ever manifold, as one sloka says that we know. So in that way, we see it in these ways. We also see it as the underlying substratum, which is unchanging. Now, as far as energy that assumes various forms, that's a very good way of looking at it too. And here's another system in which is more yogic that one could see and get a fuller grasp of Brahman with form, and of course Brahman beyond form. Here it's more of a yogic rendering. Yoga, of course, borrowed from Samkhya very, very deeply. Patanjali himself here says, by meditating upon the elements, the senses, and the mind, the hidden truth about objects gets revealed. Meditation upon the subtle elements and the sense of I-ness expands thought, awakens wisdom, and tames the ego. So you have a intelligence, you have a mind, and you have thoughts. So if you meditate on the connection between the subtle elements and the gross elements and the senses, then that begins to refine your thinking process, and it begins to awaken wisdom in you that you didn't know you had. It's all been hiding back there. And it tames your ego, because now the ego is beginning to let go of its hold on wisdom, let go of its hold on objects, and it finds it can live unattached and free and ripen itself, as Sri Ramakrishna said. It can be very content and happy in the world if it sees everything as it is and learns the art of detachment. Then, he says, meditation upon the true individual, along with its intelligence, delimits the ego and exposes the fount of joy within oneself. So he's saying really you can't meditate on the true individual until you meditate on these elements, their connection to the senses, and the connection of the senses to the subtle senses and the subtle elements. And there's the 5 pranas again mentioned in this system. Finally, he says, the Purusha, or soul, then transcends the very idea of selfhood and meditates on the awareness of cessation. Thus do the samadhis of knowledge, bliss, and I-ness lead to formlessness. Here's where we see a little bit of Lord Buddha's influence in Patanjali's yoga. See that he talks about the awareness of cessation. Sounds very Buddhist. Awareness of the cessation of thought. So when thought ceases, you'd think that the individual would go away. But it actually shows itself more there, because everything that the human being usually associates with life, objects, senses, contact with objects, thinking, stops, but then there's still a witness looking on. And that's where the soul begins to get an idea, oh, maybe I am the Supreme Being. Maybe I am in charge of the mind and intellect. All of these are my mechanisms. I'm really the Purusha, at the very crown of, you see at the top of the chart there, at the very crown and head of the whole process. I am that, in other words. I am that soul. I am pure conscious awareness. And so another great benefit to studying systems like this, the mighty river of Brahman, the Brahmachakra, the wheel of Brahman, and a system like this with yoga and Samkhya combined is very powerful. You can see there then, you must know that energy assumes various forms. So here's energy here, prana, and it assumes all of these other forms on the way down. Based upon, the sloka says, at the command of that one who is the master of the gunas and the maker of time, the omnipresent one. So that would of course be the Purusha. So this filters down like this. And you can see in the backdrop of this chart what's called unmanifested prakriti, which is a very healthy teaching for the West to imbibe. Prakriti is nature, as some of you know the Sanskrit term. So mostly in the West we think of nature as rivers, forests, hills, mountains, that kind of thing. Possibly we don't even think of sky and ether as nature. It's quite possible we just take those for granted. Air that we breathe and so forth, and the ether that space occupies, that objects occupy, that subtle space. All of those things sometimes are taken for granted. So people think that nature is just trees, rivers, rocks, mountains, and that would be it. Air and ether don't really even figure into their idea of nature. But and that's just a general going about life, thinking, oh, I'm in nature, I'm seeing things, I'm seeing sun, I'm seeing moon, and enjoying nature. So that's all, according to Samkhya, manifested nature. But to explain where that came from, manifested nature would be the effect of another cause called unmanifested nature, or unmanifested prakriti, what you see here at the backdrop of this chart. Unmanifested prakriti is all forms in potential. So it's a insentient matter and energy. It's a backdrop, and when forms seem to die or decay or go away, then they return to this unmanifested prakriti. And of course prana is the energy that's doing that, taking, you might say, life force from objects and then taking it to an unmanifested state and then bringing it back into a manifested state through subtle nerves that are a network of nerves that are running through the marvelous human form. That's a quote from Ram Prasad's poems. The marvelous human form. So the human being really has everything it wants, everything it needs. Even its very body is divine. It's cut in the divine image. So it just needs to reckon it properly. What is this body? That's why in this past chart then we would say if we knew what the body consisted of, these kinds of things, fat, bone, marrow, semen, blood, and so forth, then, and we didn't take that just in the biological sense, that that's just its physical makeup, but each of those things were produced by something else that had a cause, then we'd begin to follow a train that would connect ether to hearing, air to feeling, fire to seeing, water to tasting, and earth to smelling. Now those connections of those two quintuplications should be obvious to most people, but you'd be surprised how many people have forgotten those connections. Therefore, as I say, they just think, well, there's nature, and I'm sporting in it, or I'm playing in it, or I'm suffering in it, or I'm enjoying it, or I'm averse to it, or I'm afraid of it. And they have that disconnect going on all the time. A good case in point is being afraid of water, probably because one drowned in a previous lifetime. Dogs are like that. Some will go in the water, some won't. So there's all these disconnects in the human mind that if those connections aren't refashioned, then consciousness can't get from one place to another. The prana gets blocked. That's called granthis, or knots. There are knots in the physical form, no doubt. That's what the doctors and healers look into. But there are also knots in the psychic, in the emotional body, and in the pranic body, the energy body, that keep energy from flowing. And this isn't something you can get into and, sort of like two wires, you see, and connect them up. You have to do this with your willpower. The connecting of those two powers are done in your mind. You meditate, you see the disconnect, and through your willpower you connect it. And then you consider it connected, and you live in the connectedness of it. And pretty soon that inconsistency or that blockage disappears, just like any healing that happen. Tie two nerves together, pretty soon they'll form a healing bridge, and then energy can flow through them together. So that's all done in the mind. People sometimes don't realize that. They think they can do it through medicines or pills or healers or something. Those are maybe have some passing value and help, but it really has to be done by the soul itself through its willpower, through its energy, and that's going to take mastering the prana. If you can bring life force into a thing, and the pervasion, all pervasiveness into the whole affair, then all of a sudden healing is a matter at hand. And healing, you get past that and over that, and you begin to live in a connected manner. The mind is the hub of that healing power. It has to be the subtlest of all the senses. It's why they sometimes call it the sixth sense, because it's really like this whole chariot, is a mind complex. You see mind, ego, and intelligence. They're all connected to the soul in a very high way. They're the first things out the door. Prakritis and the Vikritis. And as we said in the earlier chart, there are some origins, and then there are some evolutes. Well, the senses and the elements are evolutes, but the mind and intelligence, those are origins. Of course, the origin of all origins would be the Purusha, or the true individual soul. So all of this is a sort of explanation to the whole central part of the page and the image here. We want to connect those 5 elements that are outside of us back to the inside of us, which is our indriyas, our gyanendriyas particularly, our knowledge senses, seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, and smelling are knowledge senses. They're supposed to grant us the ability to extract the essence of experiences out of the connection between senses and elements. And then once you can do that, you can live in a connected way. Now, it gets here, of course, the symbology of the 5 horses is used, that are 5 white horses that are pulling the chariot. We even have a version of it here in the wall of our ashram. That's very much from Krishna's Gita, the song of the Lord. But you can see it gets more and more involved when you connect, when you look at the horses and see what they're connected to. What are the senses themselves connected to after they connect with the elements? They're connected to some reins. So the reins here would be easily applied, according to this sloka we just read, as the reins of the subtle elements and the 5 pranas. There you see the list of the subtle elements audibility, tangibility, visibility, flavor, and fragrance. Those are called tanmatras in this particular tradition. 5 tanmatras. Vivekananda says about them in his Raja Yoga system, only the yogis know about them. Very few other people think about them. They're not that hard to understand, but you have to hear them first. You see that there's a power of the ear to see. There's an ear, and there's the senses ear, and there's hearing, but there's the power of audibility and what audibility means. If you can understand that, then you'll be able to have a much more complete experience out of hearing the word Om inside of you, for instance. Or you'll be able to gather much deeper and greater inspiration from the Guru's words, or the words of the scriptures, or music, arts, and so forth. The whole thing gets enhanced. So understanding the power of audibility grants you that kind of enhancement. Tangibility, visibility, flavor, and fragrance then, of course, follow the 5 senses. They're the power of the senses. They're also little gods in their own right. So those are the reins that are attached to the 5 senses. Also, other reins of prana on the other side are these 5 pranas which we just looked at in the previous chart. Life force itself, prana, expulsion, that's like excretion, assimilation, aspiration, and pervasion are words that I've chosen to define those 5 pranas. Remember, those 5 pranas are not just something that you want to look at in the physical body alone. You want to look at them in the psyche as their function in the mind, not just in the body. We're usually looking at the 5 pranas in today's spiritual circles, especially Hatha Yoga circles, as just having to do with breath only and our breathing process and breathing exercises. But you have to look at these pranas as more and more refined so that you can follow this involution process and make all the connections of your being. If you leave all these things unconnected, then it's sort of like having a wilderness without any trails in it. Somebody went through it once and cut trails, and you can see, as you look inside, you can see evidence of a trail once having been there, but it's overgrown. So you have to get in there with the machete again, which is your willpower, and follow that trail and cut down the overgrowth and undergrowth, and then open up trails again. So those are nadis or channels that have become overgrown in you. And whereas you can do that in the physical body, in nature, that connection, that's good. You probably should have never lost that. But the really important work is done in the area of psychic prana, when the mind begins to get connected with the elements, with the intelligence. And that's where you begin to not just encounter phenomena, but you begin to encounter living beings. That's where deities become important. Before that, your connections with prana and the senses and the elements and all that put you in harmony with the universe, and that's a good thing. But now you find out you can get in harmony, or want to be in harmony, with living beings, and not just human beings on earth, but deities inside of you. You want to become aware of them, make connections with them, and that's where the psychic prana and its connection to the tanmatras becomes helpful, very beneficial, and necessary for a spiritual life. And then you have friends in high places, and you begin to move inwardly in that way. And you become a walker of the skies. Lord Vashishta used that expression in his great scripture, Yoga Vashishta, his own yoga. So those are good things to say about this intermediate connection of tanmatras and prana. Those 2 things are missing in Western philosophy and cosmology. Missing. If we fill those in, then we'll start solving our problems in the emotional body and in the psychological body and in the philosophical body too. Until then, we don't have a ideation or a cosmology for those yet. Then this disconnect is very grand. And we can't get past the physical, can't get past the energetical. Energy to us also being physical, electricity, kinetic, and so forth. But we can't even begin to contemplate why I'm lifting my arm, or how I'm gathering my thoughts, how I'm speaking, because there's such a disconnect and such a blank there in that knowledge of the prana, the 5 pranas and the 5 tanmatras. Those are the 2 missing things Vivekananda has brought to us. If we fill those in, then we can get consciously and in full capacity to mind, ego, and intelligence. Or add thoughts in there too if you want, chitta, and that's called the antakarna. We saw that in the previous chart here. You see, the antakarna was listed there. And then the whole thing becomes also listed over here, antakarna. The inner organ is what that means. The inner cause. Karna means cause. So there, just with the title of the mental complex alone, they're letting you know that mind caused everything. God didn't cause it. Nature didn't cause it. Mind caused it. Antakarna, it's the inner cause of everything. Just by giving it that title alone, it pretty much clears the field, clarifies everything about where everything came from. It came from your mind in very interesting ways, not just in phantasmagorical ways, like imaginations and fantasies and things like that, but conceptions. And the whole cosmological process is mind. I mean, that probably made itself clear to you when when you saw this whole Brahma chakra here, that mind was really one grand cosmic mind was there at the hub of everything. Mahat, they call it in cosmos, in cosmology, Samkhya cosmology. So you can say this whole template here with the soul included, Purusha, is laying on top of unmanifested Prakriti. So the whole human race has everything it needs. Every individual soul has everything it needs here. It has everything in formlessness that it can pull from, and then it has everything in form that it can experience, and then it can simply return to formlessness based upon Purusha, or, to quote the Upanishad, that one who is master of the gunas, maker of time, who is omniscient, and who is pure consciousness. That's the ultimate of all. Don't leave that out of the quotient or the rest of this, just like materialists have figured that, and scientists have figured that the Earth is it with a big bang and all that, and that's the end of the story. Then you'll end with a very incomplete reckoning of reality. It'll be relativity, and that's as far as it can go. Even science is always talking about relativity, but never has any opinion or conclusion about the word reality. So if you want to get to reality, you also make sure not to leave Purusha or Brahman out of this quotient. That is, you don't want to stop at prana as being God, and you don't want to stop at mind as being God, and you don't want to stop at unmanifested Prakriti as being God just because it's formless. There's a lower formlessness, that's all this, and there's a higher formlessness, that's all this. But then there's my true nature, as Krishna says in the Gita, the supreme being, that is formlessness with a capital F. This is formlessness with a lowercase f, this is unmanifested formlessness with a lowercase f, but reality itself is formlessness with a capital F. That's Brahman, that's Nirvana, that's the highest state of consciousness, that's pure essence. Swarupa, they sometimes call it. Now, the quote at the bottom here, meditating with intense focus upon the principles of existence, the seeker defragments the mind and unifies itself with nature. Unification here is not one of identity, but one of connection. That's a good point there. You want to not identify with nature, but you want to connect everything in nature. You're the consciousness that's doing the connecting, because it's become fragmented, so you want to defragment it. So unification here is not one of identity, but one of connection. That is, oneness with nature would mean his soul is one with birth, decay, and death, and this is not the case. The soul is eternal existence. Thus, realizing that all of nature has come out of his mental process via the power of projection, the yogi takes stock of the evolutes of nature from gross to subtle, contemplates them, and masters them. In this way, he separates the true self from the apparent self and from nature. So, a good summation there of this whole process, keeping in mind that you must connect the dots, but you should always realize you're the one that's doing the connecting. And also, probably should realize you're the one that let it become disconnected in the first place. So, consciousness, forgetting itself, lets things go to seed, go to waste, and fall apart, and fragment, and disperse. And Patanjali says that's mutta mind, unhealthy mind, or vikshepa mind. Kshipta mind would be better. Kshipta mind is just fragmented, it's just let it go completely fragmented. So that's necessary then to gather it. So there's a gathering force. That's vikshipta. And then there's finally a unified place. It's called ekagra. And then finally transcendence of the whole matter, called niruddha. So those are 5 different states of mind that Patanjali mentions in his Yoga Sutras that Vivekananda has termed scattered, gathering, gathered, unified, and transcended. So 5 states of mind go with these 5 acts that you're doing, or these 5 impediments that you're under. Again, they can be either benefits or they can be detriments, depending on how you use them. So you want to use them to the highest advantage. Knowing a system like this will immediately give you the advantage over all others who are practicing yoga or learning to meditate and so forth. As I've often said, if you meditate without knowing the internal cosmological process, then you don't know what it is that you're moving through. You're just trying to seek for some formlessness somewhere, and you're sort of left at the beck and call of all these disconnections. You run into dead ends and alleyways and side tracks, distractions. But if you were to do your proper study first, qualify yourself, make the connections and meditate, the whole thing should be very smooth and very easy to reopen these trails, to reopen these nadis, and let this divine energy begin to flow again, instead of the opposite of that, which is suffering and distraction and worse. So these first 2 slokas, using these 3 particular charts, I ask you all to look back on again and do that connecting process in your meditation. It's the mind that needs to enact this process of involution. We have a new book coming out called Dissolving the Mind Stream, which gives you the techniques for that, and that should be out within a few months. Dissolving the Mind Stream. So here, I think, is a good place to break, and we'll take 10 or 15 minutes. The live streaming audience can look at the charts while we're on break, and we will come back and take Sloka 3 of this final chapter of Svetasvatara Upanishad. Thank you all for your kind attentions. Welcome back to the second half of our class on Saturday in July, summer in Portland, where we have just completed an examination of the first two slokas of chapter 6 of the Svetashvatara Upanishad, one of the great 11 Upanishads that Shankara commented on, which made them very authentic to all ways of thinking and all schools and some sampradayas in India and even abroad. There are another 99 other Upanishads, which quite often we draw from, that aren't as well studied. But Svetashvatara is one of those ones that is studied, commented on by Adi Shankaracharya, and also a more current expression of one. So it has these very beautiful references to systems like this that are well matured and well in the future. Had a lot of time to look back on the Brahmachakra and on the mighty river of Brahman and on other systems of philosophy, so they could do the most complete and cogent commentaries on them. So in this first half of this class, we looked at that Brahmachakra, it's called, mighty wheel of Brahman, the mighty river of Brahman. And we looked at the yoga philosophy in accord with Samkhya that gave us all the 24 cosmic principles. And it reminded me that Shankara himself, whom I've just mentioned, wrote these beautiful stotrams. This one, the Nirvana Shatkam, I often quote from it on the final two slokas. The final two slokas of it are Nam Rityur Nashanka Name Jati Beda. I have no death, because never a birth had I. No birth, no death, Nam Rityur. And then sometimes I quote the final verse, Aham Nirvikalpa. I am pure. I am pure conscious awareness. I am Nirvikalpa. I am the highest state. But the first four slokas I don't quote from that often, but they really epitomize these three charts we just looked at. When he says, for instance, in the first, Om Mano Bujjahamkara Chitani Naham Nacha Shrotra Jiyuve Nacha Grana Netre Nacha Vyoma Bhumir Na Tejo Navayu. So all that first verse is Om Mano Bujja Hamkara. Mano, mind, Bujja, intellect, Ahamkara, ego. Na, I'm not those. Chittani Naham, I'm not the chitta, I'm not the thoughts either. And Nacha Shrotra, Nacha Grana Netri, I'm not the Gyanendriyas, basically. So I'm not the organs of action, organs of knowledge, five senses. And then he says, Nacha Vyoma Bhumir, Na Tejo Navayo. That's fire, air, earth, water. I'm not the five elements. So in the very first verse, he starts out singing that. In the next verse, he says, Nacha Prana Sango Navai Pancha Vayu Navasapta Dhatu Nava Pancha Koshaha Navakpani Padam Nachopasta Payu. So he says, Nacha Prana Sango, I'm not the five pranas. You look back on all these charts, you can see where all of these come in, the mind, the senses, the five elements, also the five pranas and so forth, five tanmatras. He's talking about all these very same things. Na sapta nadatu na panchakoshaha. What's panchakoshaha? The five sheaths. Yeah, I'm not the five sheaths, and I'm not the seven dhatus of the body, the ingredients of the body. Remember, we had those here, right? Skin, marrow, blood, so forth. So he's doing a 700 AD version of all of this system from the standpoint that I'm the Atman. He goes on, he says, Na dvesha, na me dvesha rago, na me loba moho, mado naiva me naiva, matsarya bhavaha, na dharmo na charto, na kamo na moksha. He says, I have no liking, I have no dislike, basically. I'm not these dualities that are always coming forth. I'm not lobha or moha, I'm not delusion, I'm not greed, I have none of those. I have no matsarya, no jealousy. I have no kama, desire, nor do I have any moksha, liberation. Because I'm already liberated, I don't have to have moksha. I am that. The fourth verse, na punyam na papam, I have no merit and no demerit. Na saukyam na dukam, I have no pleasure, I have no pain. Na mantro na tirtam, I'm not the mantra, nor am I the holy place of pilgrimage. Na veda na yagyaha, not the Vedas, and I'm not the sacrifices. Aham bojam ham naiva, bojam na bhokta, I'm not the food nor its enjoyer. Fifth verse, then fifth and sixth verse I already said. Nam Richur na Shanka Name Jati Beda. He goes on to deeper, higher, more rare levels of negation, let's say, in his onward push towards transcendence. Of course, he ends it all. Chidananda Rupaham Shivoham Shivoham. So what am I then if I'm not all of the things listed on the Brahmachakra, all of the things talked about in the mighty river of Brahman, all the things mentioned in Yoga and Samkhya, all the cosmological processes and so forth that I need to master and remember and utilize for a divine life. If I'm not all those things, I must be the operator of all those things. I must be their master. I must be pure consciousness. I must be the Purusha. I must be Brahman. I am Atma Brahman. So that's the whole underlying non-dual thread running through all the pearls of the 24 cosmic principles, or 36 cosmic principles, or eightfold body, or 8 limbs of yoga, and so forth and so on. I am that. I am that. So I wanted to, it just occurred to me at the break that Nirvana Shatkam, I'm always quoting the last 2 verses to go straight to the non-dual, but this takes all of those systems and more. The mantra, the holy place, the food, the eating, it takes it all and puts it in the category of na. Not. I am not those things. So a beautiful way of expressing the Upanishads and these Vedic systems from the standpoint of pure non-dualism, Advaita Vedanta. That is the highest step and the highest strain. So, as I was saying earlier, make sure that you, in order to do the Advaita justice, that you not make the mistake of some pseudo-Advaitas and therefore jump steps and try and X out of the equation everything. Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa said, the flesh might be the best part of the fruit, and the fruit seller can sell that, and the buyer can enjoy it. But he says, I have to know the full weight of the fruit. I need to weigh its skin, I need to weigh its seeds, I need to weigh its stem, I need to weigh its rind, not just the flesh. That way I will get the full rendering of what God is. So when you talk about God with form, at least in the opinion of great beings like Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and the rishis of the past, as we can see, they want to weigh in the fruit of God with form and not exit out of the equation. I want to make sure that it's all included so that they have the fullest version of what reality is. That is, God with form and God beyond form both. The flesh, no doubt, is the essence, he says, though remember, non-duality, without that, the rest wouldn't be possible. Without Brahman, all of this would be gone. It's Brahman's wheel. It's Brahman's river. But you could take away Brahman and those things would disappear, you see. All of that in accord with the first two slokas of the Svetasvatara Upanishad. And now we come to sloka 3. And I wanted to show you in sloka 3 and also little hidden mentions that are going on here in sloka 10 and 11. In sloka 3 it says, after setting the creation in motion and withdrawing himself from it, he unites the principle of spirit with the principle of matter, with 1, with 2, with 3, and with 8, through the mere instrumentality of time and their own inherent properties. So I guess Babaji isn't the only one that's thinking in terms of numbers. The 5 kleshas, the 5 elements, the 3 this, the 4 that, the 7 that, the 10 whatevers. Babaji's got this penchant with gathering numbered systems. But you can see here in this sloka, unites spirit with matter and produces the 1, the 2, the 3, the 8, and so forth. So these numbered systems are really important in Vedanta, not just for the sake of numerology or some sort of mystery that's hidden in numbers, but for the sake of these gathered lists of things that if you become aware of, you become a master of Samkhya. And if you become a master of Samkhya, you'll never come back to this life, this earth again, not knowing the cosmological process. You can steer yourself through the kingdoms of heaven after you leave the body and back again to the body, to your next body, in full consciousness, like beings like Vivekananda and Dalai Lama and others have done. So that idea comes forth in the idea of conscious births. The palette of conscious births is that chart we looked at recently. So in this sloka, though, I want to take us into the teaching that we have time for around how does it get lost? How does this knowledge of Brahman and ourself as Atman get lost in the process? How does it get so far? How do those trails get so overgrown and we forget them? Finally, we're living just in a material world and that's it. We don't know anything else. So there's references to that. Sloka 3, withdrawing himself from it. He sets it in motion, then he withdraws itself from it. He puts spirit together with matter and then disappears and lets the whole thing, the wheel, grind on, you see, the river flow on. Or Sloka 10, he says, may the Supreme Being who spontaneously covers himself, Vivarta, he covers himself with things that make him look other than what he truly is. Form covers formlessness. Sloka 11, God, who is one only, is hidden in all beings. Why all these references to hidden and disappearing and covering power of Avarana Shakti? Those are mentioned at least 3 or 4 times in this short chapter. So I wanted to show you this from the standpoint of a tradition that's had a long time to look at the disappearance of oneself. In their tradition, in Japanese Zen, it's called ox herding. And there are 10 stages of ox herding. We had this at both Zen retreats, one of them on the Windward Waters on the Columbia River Gorge some months ago, and one a couple weeks ago in Hawaii when we had a Zen retreat. I prepared 8 Zen charts. And this is one of them. This is the newest. Most of you in Portland have not seen this, and I don't think the live stream audience has seen this. Zen Buddhism is just the most recent and mature system of India, starting in India as Dhyan, the path was called Dhyan, meditation, moved to China as Chan, That's called meditation in Chinese, and then moved to Japan as Zen. That's called meditation in that language. So Dian, Chan, Zen, all one stream. Just like Abraham, Moses, Christ, and Muhammad, one stream. In the same way in India, you had this idea of India and China and Japan. And of course, you've got to put Tibet in there and other places in which Indian Buddhism and yoga reached into these countries. So it's a very wonderful thing, all coming full circle in 1893 when Swami Vivekananda brought Vedanta to the Parliament of Religions in Chicago. At the same time in 1893, everything that was happening through India that was going toward the Far East, through China and through Japan, came full circle with a Roshi who came to the Parliament of Religions at the same time Swami Vivekananda did and brought the first Zen. So that turned into an LA center, a Zen center, and it brought over Roshis like Mayazumi Roshi and Hasutani Roshi and others. And Zen had its foothold at the same time. So it's like two arms reaching around different parts of the world coming together in Chicago in 1893. Sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So these great systems were covering the world, and over a period of some 52 generations reached Japan and then finally reached America. So with it they brought teachings like the three pillars of Zen and the three worlds and their own versions of the ancient Indian teachings. And one of these that was specific to Japan rather, and China was ox herding. It's such an art there because many of these beasts live out on the land in the rice fields and the waters and so forth, and they wander freely. There's no fences and everything. So sometimes it so happens that one of these oxes wander off, get lost, and then you have to go looking for it. So you have to bring it back and so forth. You can always find it in the jungles there because it's always got its nose in the air looking above the lush greenery. So you can always find it by its snout poking up out of the greenery. That's one of the stages, finding its snout. Smelling it out, as it were. So in this teaching, which might be kind of fun for us and not really a departure from the tradition because Zen is so connected with India, we find that there are 10 stages to ox herding. The quote here by Jikai, which is the Japanese name for Lex Hixon, our founder, given to him by a woman Roshi in Japan, says, "The ox symbolizes the intrinsic nature of consciousness, the mystery of what we are. The seeker of enlightenment must become as close an observer of consciousness as an Eskimo is of snow conditions." So if you're an Eskimo, you have to know snow conditions in order to survive. In that same way, if you're seeking enlightenment, you're going to have to know all the signs of consciousness when you look inside of yourself. And there you see, with 10 different diagrams, the seeking of traditional diagrams. Must say that you can see these 4 in the corners, how they disappear gradually. That's traditional Japanese painting too. First it's very prominent, then it becomes faded, then there's nothing in the circle, and then there's nothing in the circle with an opening, which is a stage of enlightenment that is beyond anything you can conceive of. So it's very symbolic in Japanese painting and Japanese art and Japanese tea-taking ceremony, in Japanese flower arranging. There's all these various ways that epitomize how to work Zen sensitivity into your life as an aspirant of enlightenment. So let's go through these real quick so we can see what it's like to find your lost self, epitomized by that wandering ox out in the jungles. So first you have to seek it. In Sri Ramakrishna's way of saying, you'd probably say yearn for God. But people ask him, how do we find our true self, or how do we look for God? He said, you have to yearn for God. So in that case, seeking is epitomized there, and awakening has to happen first. All of us look to certain souls who have awakened in our culture or in our time, or look back and see how certain souls have awakened and how they become sort of the harbingers for any culture to find its way towards enlightenment. So awakening is very important. There are certain signs of it. That, for instance, in Kundalini system, that energy rising up the spine, and or the detachment of a Vedantist, or the mastery of prana of a yogi, or the memorization of the cosmic principles by the Samkhya yogi. All of these things are signs of spiritual awakening. They get great interest in the subject, and they put their whole mind on it. It absorbs them completely, just like a great symphony would absorb a Johannes Brahms, or a great discovery would absorb an Albert Einstein. They get entirely absorbed in their subject. And the same here with enlightenment. After awakening, formal seeking has to begin. You'd need a teacher, and he'd have to prescribe you a practice. After that, there's a maze of pathways. And that's, of course, this conflagration of opinions and of people and various religious thoroughfares that become open to you, that you can take, and you have to decide which one. You don't spread yourself too thin, you have to choose one. So these maze of pathways is part of seeking the ox. Then exhilaration and desolation. In other words, you become inspired and put off or depressed in turns. That helps you develop forbearance, doesn't it? You begin to get the idea that you have to stay steady or persevere, and that things will put you off, and that's a test, and you have to remain strong. Things will also entice you, attract you, inspire you, and you can't get too elated about that, because then you put yourself too high on the spectrum, and when you fall next time, that is when the gunas come back again, then you have that much farther to fall because you were that much higher to begin with. So you're beginning to seek a kind of middle point or medium ground, equanimity, sthiti pragnasya, that kind of thing. And so exhilaration and desolation come in this phase, and then you begin to try and even them out. And finally, the sense of hidden essence occurs to you. When you do get that kind of equanimity in Zen, then all of a sudden you become aware of a hidden essence that's not ordinary man's consciousness, they call it, and it's not a wild fox Zen. You see back here in the maze of pathways, they call it wild fox Zen. You begin to seek too many teachings from too many different teachers instead of staying close to one. And if otherwise you get Zenbyo, Zen sickness, and you begin to fall victim to emotionalism and various things. There's all sorts of beautiful things in the way that Zen describes this that are in direct correlation to our yogic and Vedantic paths. There you see the quote at the bottom. The ox has never really gone astray. It's never really lost, in fact, especially from the ox's standpoint. The Atman's looking at you and say, you're the one that lost me. I never got lost. I just went into the free jungle, and you came looking for me. So basically, you have to take that perspective. The Atman can never really get lost to you. The Lord can never be separate from you. The mind just wanders, and sometimes imagines things that aren't true. That's called false projection. So the second stage then kicks in, finding the tracks. First, you find the wisdom teachings, in other words, they say. That's the first step. Find the wisdom teachings, and that will be the tracks leading to enlightenment again, leading to that finding of the ox. The Dharma, we call it, in all three of those, in Vedanta, in Shanzen, and in Zen Buddhism, Dharma is a very important word. That really amounts to following your own tracks. You see, you're following your own tracks. When you look at the teachings of the scriptures, they're just reminding you of wisdom that's already within you. You just need to be reminded of it, and get reoriented again. Third, fruitful illusion, they describe it. There are things that come up which are potentially beneficial, that once you see through, you can make rapid progress. And then the self begins to seem evident. Sort of like back here in this stage, you had a sense of hidden essence, but now this idea of divine self seems evident to you. In other words, it's a period where your doubt begins to go away, and finally you enter meditation for the first time. That's the second stage, is fruit, is that you are able to enter meditation on reality, sort of like the samadhana idea in Vedanta. The quote there is, "Trampled grasses show signs of the ox's presence." So the scriptures are kind of like trampled grasses. See, the sages have been there before, and they've had those realizations, and then they've recorded it for you. You merely need to open your eyes and follow the tracks. Third level of ox herding, glimpse of the ox. In other words, you get an initial experience of your own Atman, we would say in Vedanta, or of your true self, of your Buddha nature. And that, of course, freshens your enthusiasm. You want to pursue it all the more. And you get enlightened, but you're not aware of it yet. That's a very interesting. And actually that will mature to a place, too, in the future where your enlightenment is completely a given. Even other great souls are like in the Bodhisattvahood, are confirming your enlightenment for you. You are a Buddha. And so this is an early stage of that, where enlightenment dawns, but you're not really aware of it. The way we sometimes describe that in Vedanta is that when you get the mantra, then at that moment you're enlightened, but your mind has to catch up with the fact yet. And that might take 10 years, 20 years, or a whole rest of your lifetime for your mind to realize what happened to it at the time of the transmission of the mantra. Of course, using a mantra, Holy Mother says, is going to hasten that awareness. Some people just get the mantra and then they say, okay, I got my initiation, and they just sort of don't practice it. So you just let it lie fallow, like a seed that's going to need watering in the future. But she says if you get the mantra and practice it with intensity, then that decreases the time of the conscious attainment of your enlightened state. The third level there is flashes of insight. Those accompanying, like fire, like smoke, like fireflies, like the half moon, like the skull cup hitting in your third eye. You see, that's opening all the time. There's different symbologies in yoga and tantra and now in Zen and in Vedanta that have to do with those flashes of insight, like sparks or like fireflies in your consciousness. It's these openings and these insights, as if a great ocean of light's about to reveal itself. According to those flashes of insight, the practitioner at this level intensifies his or her disciplines. The intensification is a very good thing. You start to take on more of spiritual practice, lengthen your meditations, your periods of study, you go deeper in your study, and increase your devotion to God too. The quote there says, "There stands the ox in the jungle. How can he hide? He's a huge lumbering beast." So that Atman really can't hide itself from you. It'd be easier to hide a fire in a cotton cloth than to hide the truth of the Atman from your eyes. Going on to the fourth stage, this is fun, isn't it? Ox herding here is catching the ox. Therefore, you see the wild strength in the Atman. It's like primordial. I think maybe myself is just this gentle little thing that, I'll come into contact with it and it's all roses and ease and everything. But there's this dynamic primordial power in the self. Why shouldn't it be if it's one with Brahma? It should be this massive power, this dynamism. It's like concentrated Shakti. And it's all in a state of formlessness too. like compacted. So you see the wild strength of yourself, and you wonder, how do I catch that? How do I tether it? How do I bring it under my possession, under my control? And that leads to the breaking of old habits. Probably the best story we have of that is when the person went to Sri Ramakrishna and said, Sri Ramakrishna said, there's, well, the student would say, I don't have much capacity, I find. I can't put more into myself. I feel too limited. And Sri Ramakrishna said, well, if you have a cup, a glass, and you can only put 2 seers of liquid in it, like 2 pints, say, and you can't put 3 because it'll overflow. So you feel like you've taken in as much as you can. So then just take that glass to the glass blower down the street, and then have him heat it up and stretch it, and then it'll contain 3 seers, 4 seers. So the idea is that the mind can expand in its capacity to know Brahman, right? Apyayantu mamanvani vak pranaschakshu shrotamatra balamindriyani cha sarvani. May my life force flow unimpeded, may my body experience health, and may my mind expand in its capacity to know Brahman. So if you begin to feel your limitations at this stage of ox herding, and you want to bring that self under your control, fully into your possession, then the mind is going to have to go and expand itself. It's going to have to undergo some austerity. And that will be good for it. So it pushes the envelope a little bit and finds that it expands its capacity to contain 3 pints, maybe 4 pints of liquid essence. Well, then once that is done, then original mind comes forward. In the process of expansion, it sees the limitless nature of pure mind or original mind, what is called Buddha mind. In Zen Buddhism, Busho, they would say, Busho. Then further temperance and refining of the mind is undergone. Finally, it can sustain awareness at a high level, and it begins to harness the energy of enlightenment. All of those things are a stage of very precious growth called catching the ox. The quote there being, "Stubborn and unbridled, it still yearns for sweet grasses." The Atman will always yearn to be free, and your mind, its tendency, unfortunately, is to obsess, to become small, to encase itself in a body, to try and limit space. And so the mind itself has to become original mind, has to turn toward the original and long for that kind of expansion, that kind of infinitude, that kind of freedom, longing for freedom, mumukshutvam. So that is a correlation with our Vedantic teachings and called the 4 treasures and the 6 jewels. We can see the correlation there. Then there's taming the ox is the 5th stage. You must become intimate with yourself. Tantra says, you are the darling deity of your own worship. You are the darling deity of your own worship. So you begin to worship the self, your own very precious self, which is the same self in all. But in the meantime, until you have that realization, then you're going to be focusing in on this true self and developing some really special intimacy with it. And that will win the mind over, finally, from its obstinate ways. Part of that process is observing your thoughts, which is also very big in Zen, and it's also big in yoga, isn't it? Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. If you examine your vibrations of your mind, you see some of them are klista, and some of them are aklista. Some of them are beneficial, and some of them are non-beneficial. You get rid of the non-beneficial ones and just take the beneficial ones, and then go beyond them. So there's always a process of observing of thoughts. In Vedanta, it would be approached in the same way, observing the mind and detaching from it. Vairagya, viveka would be the observing of the mind, discrimination between the real and the unreal. And then vairagya, detaching from it. So whether you put it in terms of Vedanta or yoga or Zen, find out that that period of observing thoughts is very important. And that's what Atma Vichara in Advaita is good for. That is, questioning about the nature of the self. That's using the mind in a good, positive way. Then the ego ripens. That, of course, very correlative to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Apakvahamkara and pakvahamkara, he called it. If the ego is unripe, then no spiritual progress can be made. But once the ego begins to ripen, and it becomes to ripen because of its intimacy with true reality, begin to love contact with God, and contact with your own Atman, with your own self, then the ego will ripen in that case, and will not be an impediment to you anymore. Then it attains ordinariness. Ordinary man's consciousness is a big teaching in Zen. It can be just a very low esteem for oneself, but that very same ordinary consciousness, you'll find it in the realized soul too. In other words, like Holy Mother saying, "Why have you come to see me? Have I grown 2 horns?" She meant all my enlightenment took place inside, and you didn't see it outside of me. So in this idea of ordinariness, when the Zen practitioner reaches a high state of realization, you don't see it on the outside. It all happened on the inside. So in that way, it seems just like he's still the ordinary person he always was. And he considers himself to be the ordinary person he always was, right? Because he has this enlightened but unawares level of thinking already. Zen mind, beginner's mind, they call it. It's the name of a famous book, I think. Zen mind, beginner's mind. So all of that points to this growth of the spirit, but the refinement of the intellect and the trimming off of the ego all the time, constantly. Every time it wants to grow, you just trim it down, so that the growth can go on without the ego's insinuation. Very nicely put in yoga and Vedanta, and now here in Zen. Finally, you release primal awareness. The quote there is, "Tended, it becomes gentle. Untethered, it follows its master." So now that intimacy and the refinement has gone through, the self will want to adhere to you, and you'll want to adhere to the self. Sort of like Krishna is saying in the Gita, "They are dear to me, and I am dear to them." But before that intimacy happened, they were in me, but I was not in them, right? He says that, sort of confusing in the Gita when you hear that. All beings are in me, but I am not in them. It means they're all in my regime of Maya, marching on. They're on the wheel of Brahmachakra, going around and around that belt with its felly, nature, running on the triple tires of the gunas and so forth and so on, or floating down that river with all the whirlpools and eddies and currents. So they're in his prakriti, you see, but he's transcendent of his prakriti. So in that same way, then finally, when that intimacy comes, then all of a sudden the self, the apparent self and the real true self begin to adhere to each other, and that ordinary consciousness becomes that supernatural consciousness, you see. And almost nothing happened except just to return to the source. The ox has come home. You don't need to tether it anymore. You don't need to, at least you don't need to watch it, Did I forget myself? Where did it go? It's become a natural state that it's there with you all the time. That leads to the 6th state. You can see how these are successively more and more refined, more and more beautiful. That's riding the ox home. Illumination visits you, simplicity occurs, spontaneity dawns, you radiate realization and become aware of the subtle illusions behind everything. Finally, you cognize separation. You see the primal separation between soul and matter, between God and mankind, between creature and creator. you see those lines of demarcation and begin to erase them. And that's where this line is beginning to get erased, so that it will turn more like this. The cycles can go on, but you're free to get in and out of them. That's basically what this means. Maya will go on, everything will go on just as before, but you're free of it. And you can see it as for what it is. So you can see it from transcendent position. The quote there, astride the ox's back, he gazes serenely at the clouds above. So, sort of like Sri Ramakrishna's story of the sailor putting out to sea and storm hits him and he has to bail and trim the sail and fight for his very life. So he's almost a goner. See? But then the moon comes, clouds go away, the moon is out, he trims the sail, puts the compass on, puts the rudder on automatic pilot, stuffs his pipe of tobacco, sits back, smoke, watches the stars, has a beautiful journey. See? So that's a story that's correlative to this. Riding on the ox's back and gazing serenely around at the clouds. That's the riding the ox home phase. Then the ox is forgotten totally, completely. Forgotten here doesn't mean that you forget the nature of the self, of course. It's just become so much one with you that you're not thinking of it in terms of being separate from you anymore. In other words, there's no separation between creature and creator or God and mankind anymore. Mankind feels like he is God, walking around on two legs. That's Vivekananda's quote, actually. Mankind is just God walking around on two legs. So that state has become so naturally that he's not trying to remember the ox anymore. It's one with him. The first level of that is everything is attained. Like Krishna said in the Gita, I mentioned it the first half. I have got everything I need from the worlds. I don't need anything more, Arjuna. Now I just come back for the good of human beings. Loka Sangraha. Daily life is enlightenment. Daily life is enlightenment. That's a very famous teaching in Zen. You drink tea in enlightenment. You arrange the flowers in enlightenment. You go through your physical exercises, your martial arts, or whatever it is. So you go through all of that in enlightenment. Your Tai Chi. You walk in enlightenment. You talk in enlightenment. Everything has become a natural state. So those are the signs of a person living in realization. Your meditation is natural. We all wish we could reach a state where meditation was natural, and not only our formal sitting meditation is natural, but meditation with eyes open is also natural. One of Holy Mother's famous statements we like is, does God exist only when eyes are closed and then cease to exist when you open them? And people are thinking, oh, now I'm spiritual. Well, now I'm not spiritual anymore. See, and their eyes open. So that's not the case. God exists whether eyes are open or not. So you have to come to see God in everything and act the same way in meditation. Meditation becomes natural to you, in other words. And furthermore, action even becomes meditation. Here's where Karma Yoga and Dhyan Yoga synthesize nicely. It's a very mature state of existence when you can put together action and inaction into one. Non-action, you might say, or the non-accrual of karma even while you're moving amongst the world and the body. So that's, of course, reaching a very mature level of realization. And the two results of that are infinite peace and bliss. The bliss of two-ness, that is, you still have this sense of separation in you, slight sense of separation because you're enjoying the bliss. So the bliss in you are still two things. The quote there is, the ox has now vanished, and alone and serene sits the man. Another quote out of the scriptures of Zen, it says, he sits near his hut with his straw hat on, and the ox across the field, grazing peacefully, the tether and the whip lay by his side unused. So he doesn't have to herd his ox anymore. The two can exist in two-ness, the bliss of two-ness, you see. Now the 8th, is it, level of ox herding is ox and self are both forgotten. That is, there's neither delusion nor holiness in that person. It's a completely natural state, spontaneous, always open to fullness. Life is enlightenment. All things emanate awareness. So now it's not just that inside of you you're enjoying that bliss, but that sense of two-ness is beginning to disappear, and you begin to see outwardly that same Brahman, the same conditions of that state of freedom in everything. The quote there says, "He lingers not in the Buddha and passes through the not Buddha." So they're beginning to bring it in terms of the philosophy now. He lingers not in the Buddha. That is because that would be making a distinction between him and the Buddha. And he lingers not, he just passes through the not Buddha, everything that is anatman, they would say in Buddhism. Yeah, and you can see these are getting harder and harder to define, but Zen is doing a pretty good job of doing it. That 9th and penultimate state's called return to the source. That is, from formless to form without any change, is how they describe it. It goes from formlessness to form without any change, as if the two are one and the same thing. So you're coming in and out of, say, retreat and going back to your normal life as if there was no change, back into retreat. It's all one state of awareness, and you're able to manage that now. All is a circle of emptiness. That's this stage here. Circle of emptiness. Cycles are going all around you, but you realize everything is empty. Nothing, you're already fulfilled, so nothing, no seeking of desire or fulfillment is there anymore. And you see that all phenomena are just spontaneous arising. We call it praticca samudpata. Everything is just spontaneously arising out of consciousness, falling back into consciousness. And it's a kind of blissful emptiness. And life is manifestation of source. And the humans are gone, only transhuman flavor remains. It's a way of Zen would put it, that you don't see human beings anymore, you just see Buddha nature and everything. And it's got a slight flavor of humanity to it. That is the enlightened human. Now my only desire, Ram Prasad Singh, now that the dross of my consciousness has been purged, is to build a temple with that consciousness. Fully, that temple is going to be called fully enlightened humanity. I long to see that temple. So his only intention from there on out is to see enlightened humanity. To see humanity fully enlightened, that's what he longs to see. That's his temple. He's building it out of his own consciousness. His consciousness has been purged of dross. So you have that beautiful song that Ram Prasad sings. And very much in accord with this. Humans are gone, only transhuman flavor remains. You can almost catch a taste of that Zen state, where you're just moving amongst humanity, and all you're feeling is just, all you're feeling and seeing is just God. God manifest everywhere. The quote there is, "Seated in his hut, bridle and whip lying idle, he hankers not for the things outside anymore." He stays in the hut of his own consciousness, contented and blissful there. Then the only thing left to do at that stage is sort of the bodhisattva idea. Enter the marketplace with helping hands. Perfect emptiness in action is the first sign of that. In other words, there won't be any intention or desire for the fruits of action, as we say in Karma Yoga and Vedanta. You just perfect emptiness in action. You do the act in a empty, transparent way, and move through all the cause and effect without any undue deviations. Then transform poison into nectar. That's, of course, very tantric. We have that in our own Shiva Shakti tradition, transforming poison into nectar like Lord Shiva did. So that will be one of the great capacities, great qualities that a fully enlightened being will gain. Be able to move amongst the world and transform all the poisons there into nectar. Because you're seeing divinity in everything and you're in a refined state doesn't mean like everyone is there yet. You're still working towards that for the good of all human beings. So in the process, while they're getting their act together, then the enlightened soul is going to learn how to transmute the poison into nectar. And that's going to be a capacity that protects him or her and also benefits those people that they're working with. Stripped of powers, causes all to bloom with highest potential. So we already looked at the various powers in the Brahma Chakra wheel that could act as impediments. So here, Zen has that idea too, is that the powers all go away. Everything is just spontaneous and perfect. And because of contact with a soul like that, other souls will realize their highest potential in a much swifter fashion and with a much surer and certain path. The quote there is, "The gate of the hut is closed, and even the wise cannot find him." So sort of like a sangha. First there was sangha where holy company was had, and then the soul becomes so enlightened that they don't need groups of holy people anymore. They withdraw into a sangha. That's teaching in Vedanta. Same here in Zen. They become so transparent that very hard to recognize a soul like that in the world. So a quick run through in less than an hour the 10 stages of ox herding. Jugyu no Zu, they call it in Japanese Zen. All about the ox having been lost, and all in accordance then with those slokas, setting the creation in motion and withdrawing himself from it, spontaneously covering himself, that one God hidden in all beings. So those kinds of references in this chapter 6 being very much in accord with this Zen ox herding, and why the reason that we would bring it up. Please, if you have any questions about this, then save them for satsang if you're live here in Portland with me, or you may send in emails and ask more about them, because there's, of course, we could spend much longer time on it. But it's a very nice addendum to what we're studying. Now, we still have to deal with this rest of this sloka 3, in which it says, he unites the principle of spirit with the principle of matter, with 1, with 2, with 3, and with 8. If you really wanted to look at it, you would look back on this Brahma Chakra, and you'd see some of these 1s and 3s, like Jnana, Adharma, and Dharma could very well be a good illustration of the 3. Avidya, Dharma, and Adharma, the good and evil effects of past lives, the 3 bodies, that is, physical, subtle, and gross, all of those things could be the meanings for the sloka. Also, 8-fold body of nature could mean the 8. That is, when the principle of spirit gets mingled with the principle of matter, it's a matter of relationship. It's not a matter of identification, or it shouldn't be a matter of identification. It should just be a matter of association. Spirit is associating. Consciousness, that is associating with the things that the mind has manufactured. And if they're all under the control of the soul, then everything is a sattvic creation, like Lord Brahma's creation. Otherwise, It's very erratic. It's called Maya or samsara, and it's full of dualities like that include suffering and so forth. But when you're talking about twos and that kind of thing, then you might want to look towards a chart such as this, which we won't have time to do today, but it's not a chart that we've looked at very often either. It's one of the older charts brought forward very seldomly, but it's called Triloka. Triloka means three worlds. There's also a Zen Buddhist teaching about the three worlds that is interesting to see. Maybe tomorrow I can put those up for you across the two chart stands and we can compare them. But for now you can see there these threes that the Sloka, Upanishad Sloka talks about have to do with the three worlds and the three bodies. This is a different way, rendering of it than we usually see. There's the immanent world, or Stula Jagad. There's the transcendent world, Sukshma Jagad. That is the psychological world, or the world in your mind. And then there's the absolute, or the Karna Jagad, the subtlemost, sometimes called the causal or spiritual world. There you see under those designations different sets of threes and eights and 24s even that have been listed under there, all under the designation of the three bodies, or the three worlds. Remember, when we say three worlds, you also have three bodies that go with it. That's the way that the young Hindu youth would be raised, to think of not just the physical body as we have had the disadvantage of being born in, but the idea that you have a psychological body and a subtle body too. Maybe the psychological body is included somewhat in our Western way of thinking. It's not really designated as such. It's like, oh, you have a mind, but the mind is considered a brain, and the brain and body are considered one thing. But when you start thinking about the powers of the mind and how bodies have come out of the mind, that bodies get produced by mind, and so does air, earth, fire, water, and ether exist in the mind, and so does time, space, and causation exist in the mind. And you begin to look at all these things and you trace them for their origin, utpatti. You think, well, my goodness, they all exist back in my mind, because when my mind goes to deep sleep tonight, they disappear. Or when my mind goes to death, they disappear. Also, amazingly enough, when my mind goes into deep meditation, formlessness, they disappear. So they must have all come out of the mind, and they must all merge back in the mind. So you come to this apt and final conclusion called Vedanta Siddhanta, the conclusion of the Vedanta, that everything is mind. The Buddhists definitely concur with that. Their whole system is based on mind-only schools. So anything in form comes from the mind. And if you want to go to the formless, then you'd have to go beyond mind to get to Brahman. But you can see some of the designations here. The three realms, for instance, Adi Buddha, Adi Daiva, and Adi Atma. Adi Buddha is the world of living beings, falls under the immanent world. Adi Daiva is the world of celestial beings. That falls under the transcendent mind, prana and mind actually. And then Adhyatma is the supreme being, the original Atman, Adhyatman, the original self, and that would fall into the designation of the spiritual world only. That is pure consciousness. Other designations, whether they're in threes or not, come forward. There you see the four states of awareness. Remember those? Waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and so how would they fall into three worlds? Waking would fall under the physical world. Dreaming and deep sleep would both fall under the transcendent world, and under the spiritual world you'd put pure awareness, Turiya. Of course, deep sleep would have a correlation back and forth over the bar line, you might say, with both the Karna and the Sukshma Jagad, taking you as if it were a porthole into formlessness and back into form again. It would be the, if thine eye be single, you shall know the truth kind of idea. This chakra has two petals. And consciousness goes out one and comes in the other, you might say, like a waterfall spilling out, and then a great vacuum sucking back in. So souls in streams are always moving in and out. That's called Kaivalya Pragbara, stream of enlightened souls coming in and out of this chakra. Where this going in and out of these lower chakras is called Samsara Pragbara, cycles of birth and death and ignorance. And these chakras in between are intermediary places that have to do with higher worlds. So it's a very beautiful system that takes all of this into consideration and gives us commentary and discourse and transmission of it. Then the next one there, you see the three cosmic functions: projection, sustenance, and withdrawal. Under the auspice of the Trinity, Lord Brahma, Lord Vishnu, and Lord Shiva. That is, we'd call it apparent creation or projection, assumed preservation or sustenance, and supposed destruction or dissolution. Those three would fall under waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. They'd also fall under Stula Jagad, Sukshma Jagad, and Karana Jagad, the physical, the subtle, and the causal worlds. So in this way, Triloka works its way down already to three cosmic functions. And then finally, you could even put the eightfold body that we just looked at here in the Brahma Chakra and in the Mighty River of Brahman chart under this threefold designation. See, the eightfold body is made of the physical body, ego, mind, and intellect, five senses of action, and the Atman, right? So we can see how the physical body would fall under the Stula Jagat, the immanent world, and then ego, mind, intellect complex with the senses could fall under the subtle world, and then how the Atman itself could be reserved only for the absolute world, also called Kundalini Shakti there. Now, very interesting to see how the 24 cosmic principles, 5 sheaths, fall under this triple designation, but I think we're going to leave that for tomorrow because it's a little bit more involved. And I will, at the beginning of tomorrow's class, bring forward the Buddhist version, Zen Buddhist version of the three worlds. We can see that side by side with this Triputi chart, or Triloka chart rather, and we'll be able to see the correlations and broaden our capacity, our mind's capacity to know all of this. And if you find it's too much, then just I'll give you the phone number of a nearby glass blower. Go down there and just stretch your glass cup to contain more. So let's end here with a chant and move on towards tonight's puja here at SRV Oregon and tomorrow morning's meditation in class. Om Tachnayo, Om Tachnayo Ravrinni Mahe Gatung Yagyaya Gatung Yena Pataye Daivi Svastrastu Naha Svastir Manusebhyaha Urdvam Jigatu Besajam Sangnoastu Dvipade Sangchatushpate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May we make a great offering into the Great Self. May we always revere the Lord and Mother of all sacrifices. May divine blessings be upon us. May peace be unto the entire human race. May healing, well-being, and prosperity also abide among us. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Peace, Peace, Peace. May peace be unto us. May peace be unto all. Om Hari Om.